Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest stories. They say from the outside looking in, everything looks perfect. And maybe it did. The neatly trimmed hedges.
The family portrait linen the staircase.
Lena, radiant in every holiday card, smiling beside her husband James and their two bright-eyed kids. But behind the walls of that picture-perfect suburban life, something was unraveling, and had been for years. Lena didn't notice it at first. It wasn't a loud collapse, but a slow erosion. Like water wearing down stone. She had traded heels for house slippers, brainstorming sessions for grocery lists, and somewhere in between PTA meetings and laundry cycles, she stopped hearing her own thoughts. Her days were full, but she felt empty. It wasn't that James was cruel or unfaithful. He was kind, responsible, always there. And yet, that was the problem. He was there, but he wasn't with her. Not really. The silence between them wasn't angry. It was polite. Sterile. She had a life many would envy, but each day she felt more like a background character in her own story. A life built on love now felt like it was held together by routine. And deep down, Lena began to wonder, what if this wasn't what she signed up for? What if she was quietly disappearing? It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden rupture, no blazing argument or slammed doors. The intimacy between Lena and James faded like colors left too long in the sun, gradually, until one day she woke up and realized she couldn't even remember the last time they had truly seen each other. Their conversations had thinned out to bare necessities, doctor appointments, dinner plans, bills. Their I love yous had become habitual, spoken out of rhythm rather than passion. Lena missed the version of James who used to write little notes on sticky pads and leave them by her coffee. She missed the way he used to ask about her dreams like they mattered. But somewhere between baby bottles and carpool lines, they had fallen into a partnership of logistics, not love. The spark hadn't gone out in flames, it had been dimmed by survival, sleep deprivation, and the slow, quiet compromise of time. And now, every night as Lena crawled into bed next to James, his back turned toward her, already halfway into sleep, she felt the ache of distance more than ever. She would lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering how two people who once shared everything now shared nothing but a bed and a calendar. It wasn't anger she felt. It was a deep, gnawing loneliness. And what terrified her most wasn't that they had stopped loving each other. It was that maybe they hadn't even noticed. Maybe love had turned into something too quiet to recognize anymore. Restlessness doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives in silence, wrapped in predictability, disguised as comfort. Lena moved through her days like clockwork, packing lunches, wiping counters, answering school emails, folding laundry into perfect little piles. She smiled when expected, laughed when appropriate, but inside, something stirred.
A soft, persistum of dissatisfaction.
She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. Nothing was wrong, but nothing felt right either. Her life was stable, safe, and suffocating. Every morning she stared into the mirror and saw a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes had lost their spark, her voice rarely rose above a practical tone. The most exciting part of her week was choosing which podcast to listen to while running errands. It was a strange kind of emptiness, one that couldn't be filled by gratitude or guilt. Because yes, she was grateful. For her children. For James. For the roof over their heads. But that didn't stop the ache. Gratitude, she learned, couldn't smother longing. What Lena missed most wasn't luxury or excitement, it was aliveness. Spontaneity. Someone asking her how she was and waiting long enough to hear the real answer. In the stillness of her tidy, well-managed world, Lena's heart had become a quiet drum, beating restlessly against the walls of routine. She didn't know what she was looking for. She just knew she hadn't felt seen in a long, long time. And somewhere inside, a question kept rising, louder each day, is this it? The invitation came casually, almost as an afterthought. A neighbor mentioned a small writing group that met on Thursday nights at the local bookstore, nothing fancy, just a few people sharing stories and coffee. Lena almost said no. After all, it had been years since she wrote anything beyond to-do lists and grocery notes. But something inside her whispered go. That first night, she walked in with nerves buzzing just beneath her calm exterior, clutching a blank notebook like armor. The bookstore smelled of old pages and espresso, the kind of place that made you feel like anything was possible. And in that cozy circle of strangers, something awakened. For the first time in years, she introduced herself not as just a mom or James's wife, but as Lena, who used to love poetry, who once dreamed of publishing stories that made people feel. As the group read their work and shared reflections, Lena felt a spark flicker in her chest. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition. Here, in this little pocket of the world, she remembered a version of herself she'd buried beneath duty and dishes. She left that night with ink on her fingers and breath in her lungs she didn't know she'd been missing. It wasn't about escape, it was about return. That bookstore became her secret sanctuary, a place where her soul stretched and yawned awake. And somewhere between the stories and the silence, Lena began to remember who she used to be, and wonder who she still could become. Elliot wasn't what Lena expected. He didn't command the room or speak in grand, sweeping gestures. No, he was quieter than that, attentive in a way that felt almost old-fashioned. He listened, really listened. When someone spoke, he leaned in, eyes steady, absorbing their words like they mattered. And when Lena shared a short piece she'd written, a fragment about a woman who had forgotten how to dream, he didn't just nod politely. He looked at her and said, "There's something honest in that. It lingers." That comment stayed with her for days. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even personal. But it felt like someone had seen past her polished smiles and tired eyes and into something deeper. Over the weeks, their conversations grew, about writing, about life, about the subtle ache of starting over. Elliot never crossed a line, but his presence lit up something inside her. He remembered the name of her favorite author. He asked thoughtful questions. He noticed the way her hands fidgeted when she was thinking. And Lena found herself anticipating Thursday nights not for the group, but for the rare comfort of being seen without having to explain herself. With James, everything had become functional. With Elliot, it felt alive.
Note romantique.
Not yet. But quietly electric, like standing near an open flame and pretending not to notice the warmth. Lena told herself it was harmless. But deep down she already knew, this connection was more than it seemed. And that realization both thrilled and terrified her. It was the smallest things that gave her away, the extra swipe of lipstick before heading out, the subtle way her fingers lingered near her phone when it buzzed, the way her pulse quickened at the sound of Elliot's name. Lena told herself it was nothing. They were just friends. He was kind, thoughtful, present. But she couldn't ignore the thrill, the way her chest fluttered when he complimented her writing, how her world felt just a little more vivid after their conversations. It wasn't that she wanted something physical. It was that, for the first time in years, she felt alive. And that was the most dangerous part. Because when you've been numb for so long, even a whisper of feeling can feel like a roar. She began to notice how often she imagined what she'd wear to the next meeting, wondering if Elliot would comment on her earrings. She caught herself crafting clever replies to his texts, rereading them before hitting send. James hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had and didn't know what to do with it. Lena knew she wasn't cheating, not in the way people talked about in hushed tones. But in the quiet of her heart, a new kind of betrayal was blooming. One built not on touch, but attention. She had never hidden anything from James before. But now, there were pieces of her life she didn't offer. And even though nothing had happened, something had changed. A line had been drawn. And Lena was already standing on the wrong side of it. It crept in quietly, like fog curling around the edges of a familiar path. Lena wasn't lying, not exactly. She still kissed James goodbye, still asked about his day, still packed lunches and signed permission slips. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside? She was living a secret in plain sight. Her connection with Elliot wasn't hidden behind locked doors, it was tucked between shared glances, carefully worded messages, and the electric silence that followed their conversations. There were no lies, just omissions. And somehow that felt worse. She would smile across the dinner table while her thoughts were still drifting back to something Elliot had said about a poem, or the way his voice softened when he asked how her writing was going. Lena hated the way her heart now split its loyalty between two truths, the steady love she'd built with James, and the thrilling awareness that someone else saw her in a way she hadn't felt seen in years. She knew she was treading dangerous ground. The emotional intimacy she shared with Elliot was the kind that could unravel a life, not with scandal, but with silence, with longing. And yet, she couldn't seem to let it go. Not yet. Because the ache of being unseen had been so deep, so persistent, that even this quiet attention felt like salvation. She was walking a tightrope, balancing between who she was, who she used to be, and the woman she wasn't sure she had the courage to become. It was nothing really, a shared look across the room, a pause in conversation that lingered a second too long. But in that moment, Lena felt the shift like a jolt beneath her skin. It happened during the writing group's fall gathering, surrounded by cider and string lights, laughter echoing through the bookstore's back room. Elliot read a quote, something haunting and tender, and when his eyes met hers, the world seemed to still. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The silence between them said more than words ever could. Lena felt exposed, like he could see everything she'd been trying to bury, the restlessness, the loneliness, the ache she had stopped admitting to herself. Later, as the group thinned out and people drifted home, Elliot waited until she was alone to say, "Sometimes we bury the things that hurt us, thinking it'll make them disappear. But they don't. They just wait." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even an invitation. It was understanding. And that terrified her more than anything. Driving home, Lena's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Her heart pounded, not from guilt, but from recognition. She hadn't touched him. He hadn't touched her. But something had touched her deeply. That night, as she lay beside James, his soft snore a steady rhythm in the dark, she realized she was standing on the edge of a choice. Not just between two men, but between denial and awakening. And for the first time in years, she couldn't pretend she didn't feel it. The guilt didn't crash over her like a wave, it seeped in, slow and quiet, like water through a crack in the foundation. Lena couldn't point to a single moment when things had gone too far. There had been no secret rendezvous, no whispered confessions or lingering touches. And yet, she knew in her bones that something inside her had already crossed the threshold. Every message from Elliot, every thoughtful comment, every moment when their eyes met and held for just a second too long, they stayed with her. They echoed through the holes of her mind long after she'd returned to her carefully curated life. She would watch James from across the room, folding laundry or helping Ella with her science project, and a pang of sorrow would hit her. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had no idea she was carrying this invisible weight, this quiet betrayal of thought and feeling. And that only made it worse. Because this wasn't about passion or desire, it was about recognition.
About feeling alive again.
Lena didn't want to leave James. She didn't even want Elliot, not really. What she wanted was the version of herself she had become when Elliot saw her, the vibrant, engaged, interesting woman she had forgotten she could be. And that truth unraveled her. Because the deeper her connection to Elliot grew, the more impossible it became to live the lie that everything in her marriage was fine. Something had cracked open. And now, she couldn't pretend not to notice the light pouring in. Late at night, when the house was still and even the hum of the refrigerator felt loud, Lena found herself sitting cross-legged on the floor of her walk-in closet, an old notebook balanced on her lap. The pages smelled of dust and old dreams. She hadn't written in years, not really, but now the words poured out, raw and aching. She didn't write about Elliot. Not directly. She wrote about the quiet ache of losing herself, about the girl who once stayed up past midnight scribbling story ideas and believed her words could change the world. Somewhere between school drop-offs and PTA meetings, that girl had disappeared. Lena wrote, "I don't know when I stopped being someone with dreams and became someone just trying to keep everything afloat." The sentence sat heavy on the page, staring back at her like a confession. It wasn't James's fault. He hadn't asked her to fade.
Life just happened. Slowly, quietly, and without warning.
She had traded ambition for stability, passion for practicality. And now, in the silence of the closet, she was reckoning with the cost. Elliot hadn't awakened something new in her, he had reminded her of something lost. Her desire to feel, to create, to matter beyond motherhood and marriage. And though the guilt pressed hard against her chest, so did something else, an ember of selfhood beginning to burn again. In the dark, alone with her words, Lena wasn't a wife or a mother. She was simply herself. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The choice was quiet, but it thundered in her chest. Lena knew she couldn't keep walking the thin line between reality and fantasy. She hadn't physically betrayed James, but emotionally? She was already drifting. And that drift had become a storm inside her, restless, churning, impossible to ignore. So she did the one thing she hadn't done in weeks, she reached out to Elliot. Not to feed the flame, but to extinguish it. They met at a park on a grey November morning, the sky heavy with unshed rain. He greeted her with a gentle smile, his hands tucked deep in his coat pockets.
Der was no embrasse, no dramatique goodbye.
Just two people standing at the edge of something that almost was. Lena spoke first, her voice trembling. She told him the truth, not just about James, but about herself. How this connection had made her feel seen, alive, real again. But that if she continued, she would lose more than her marriage, she'd lose her own integrity. Elliot nodded, his expression tender and understanding. You've got a good heart, Lena, he said softly.
Don't lose that.
And just like that, it was over. She walked back to her car with tears streaming down her face, not because she regretted what hadn't happened, but because she knew she was doing the right thing. It wasn't a clean ending, it was a reckoning.
A line drawn in the sand.
And as painful as it was also the first step back toward herself. That night, after the kids were tucked into bed and the house had gone quiet, Lena sat on the edge of the couch and turned to James. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of unspoken truth. I need to talk, she said, her voice low. James looked surprised, maybe even a little wary, but he muted the TV and gave her his full attention. I've been feeling off, she said. Like I lost something along the way. Maybe even myself. The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable. James nodded slowly. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said. And that was it. No questions. No reaching for her hand.
No deeper curiosity.
Lena waited, hoped for more. But it never came. He turned back to the screen, offering a soft "You know I love you, right?" She said I know, and she did, but the words felt hollow, like echoes of something they used to mean. In that moment, the gap between them felt like a canyon. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't see her. Not really. And maybe he hadn't for years. That conversation didn't break their marriage, but it laid bare its truth. They had been drifting in parallel lanes, sharing a house, a bed, a life, without ever really touching the heart of each other anymore. Lena didn't want to blow up their world. She wanted to wake it up. But now, she wasn't sure if James even realized it had fallen asleep. It didn't happen overnight, but something in Lena shifted after that conversation. She stopped waiting for James to notice her unraveling and started stitching herself back together. Not out of defiance, but out of survival. She began waking up early again, not to pack lunches, but to write. Small pieces at first, scenes, fragments, bits of poetry. She looked into renewing her old marketing license, brushing off the dust of dreams she once shelved for later. And when she told James she wanted to return to work, not for money, but for meaning, he nodded, unsure but supportive. They didn't have a dramatic breakthrough.
No Thierry, Soulbarine confession.
But slowly, their conversations began to stretch beyond logistics. They talked, not just about the kids, but about the things they missed, the things they hoped for. James didn't ask about Elliot. Lena didn't offer. Not yet. Because the story wasn't about him. It never really was. It was about Lena, choosing to come back to her own life instead of slipping away from it. The flame Elliot sparked wasn't meant to last, it was meant to light her path home. Nearly a year later, Lena still carries the echoes of that season like a well-worn melody. Her marriage isn't perfect, but it breathes again. So does she. And when she looks in the mirror now, she sees a woman who didn't run away, but ran toward herself. Who remembered that before she was a wife or a mother, she was someone. And that someone was worth finding again. In today's fast-paced, hyper-connected world, it's easy to lose yourself in roles, parent, partner, provider, until you forget who you are. Lena's story is a quiet reminder that emotional neglect isn't always loud, and fulfillment doesn't come from escaping, but from rediscovery. So check in with yourself. What makes you feel alive, inspired, seen? Don't wait for a crisis to start asking those questions. Nurture your passions, protect your sense of self, and speak your truth before silence builds walls. You don't need a new life, you may just need to reclaim the one you already have. Start by remembering you still matter.